I do want to begin by honoring the Lenape ancestors of this land, a practice I am so intent on doing every time I speak, the indigenous ancestors of this land, and asking them for permission to greet you in my own native tongue. Vaiguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaiguru Ji Ki Fateh, which means the beloved community belongs to divine oneness, and so does all that it achieves. I am so grateful to be here with you all this morning. I am so grateful to our big sister, the Reverend Jackie Lewis, for creating this marvelous container where we can reflect together on Dr. King's legacy and how to interrogate the ethic of revolutionary love for a new time, for a new era, for a new generation. In a moment, I'm going to be calling Parker Palmer onto the stage, a person who needs very little introduction, author, activist, teacher, and for those of us who have been touched by his work, luminary, bodhisattva. He has poured his wisdom into an entire generation, including me. I first read Let Your Life Speak when I was in my 20s, struggling with my own vocation. And Parker, your words gave me permission to pursue my own unmistakable magic. Your book, Healing the Heart of Democracy, gave me permission to name the heart as the wellspring for social and political transformation. And your new book, about to come out, On the Brink of Everything, is about what it means to grow old, about what it means to live a life well. It's about how to live, but how to last. After this last election, I've been trying to figure out how to last. And so, through some magic, I was able to connect with Parker, not just through words on a page, but in person through this remarkable friendship, this remarkable mentorship. And so when we were designing this conference, we thought, oh, yes, please, Parker, come and speak about your new book. And Parker said no, and I was so disappointed. And he said, I want to come and speak about your book, about your work. You see, in the last year, Parker has been watching us build this movement that we're calling revolutionary love. He has been watching us take the ethic of love that was on the lips of Gandhi, King, Mandela, and interpret it for a new time through a feminist lens. We're defining love as labor, love as sweet labor, fierce, bloody, imperfect, ongoing, life-giving, a choice we have to make over and over again. And our particular role in this movement at the Revolutionary Love Project is to found this movement, is to give this movement intellectual and spiritual foundation in unpacking what the ethic looks like, what it means to practice it. My team is here today. Will you stand up, Annette and Melissa and Deep and Juliana? There you are, my loves. Amy. This tiny, remarkable team, we've curated a network of fellows that are pulling from ethics and neuroscience and public health and conflict resolution and education. We're pooling all of this knowledge together to build a curriculum, to write this book. We're generating stories and tools and mass mobilizations with our lead partner, Love Army. Love Army, where are you? They're here. They're maybe over here, but love, there we are. Ah, my love. They're tweeting all of this out, you see. So with Love Army, we've been working with the Women's March, with V-Day, and with Auburn Senior Fellows and Auburn Seminary, including so many of them who are here, including the Reverend Jackie Lewis. I see Brian McLaren. I see Reverend Michael Ray Matthews, Sister Simone Campbell, Reverend Otis Moss, Stosh Kotler, Angel Kyoto Williams. They've all been my thought partners in this last year, including Victor Kazanjian. Victor, can you raise your hand? of United Religion Initiatives. My conversations with you, Victor, you have been helping me midwife this ethic in the last year. And so to see you all here in this audience is so beautiful. It's so life-giving to me. No one does anything alone. We are building a movement together. And so what Parker and I decided is that we would try to model this on stage. Model the deep listening and the laboring together. And so it's now my pleasure to invite Parker Palmer to join me.
Thank you.
Parker, our vision at the Revolutionary Love Project and the vision that so many of us are sharing is to make love a public ethic over the next 25 years. That we're interested in what the world might look like if we could see love modeled, practiced on the news, in politics, in the media, on stages like this. And so what you proposed was for us to do this in our hour together. And for that, I am so grateful.
Thank you. I am too. Thank you. I just want to say one word at the outset about the impact of this conference on me. I was sitting over there asking myself, what is this feeling? It's not fear, because I'm used to being in front of 20,000 people who don't necessarily like me. Because I want to talk to professors about love or physicians about love, and it's not always a popular topic. But what this feeling is right now is on the edge of tears. On the brink of everything is where you have allowed me to be as I approach age 80, with continued deepening learning about race and poverty and gender and sexual orientation and my own place in a society that I want to be involved with to the very end. One of the theme notes in my new book is, old is just another word for nothing left to lose. So get out there and take some risks on behalf of the common good. And that's what you're helping me understand. And just one more thing before I hear more about Valerie's project and do the kind of listening that I've been so blessed to do for the last couple of years. I'm a Quaker. We're supposed to learn how to listen because we sit in silence, and there's no sense to that if you're not listening. And actually, if you know many Quakers, that weekly hour of silence is essential, because otherwise they'd be talking all the time. Reverend Otis Moss last night gave me an image that I have never articulated before, because I just got it last night, so I'll risk articulating it. He gave me the image of a jazz ensemble in which even I could have a part. To be a part of a jazz ensemble, you have to know your instrument. And my instrument is a white body, a white consciousness, filled with white privilege, and, as I've recently written, my own form of white supremacy. I think it's a cop-out for white people to say white supremacy is limited to those people who wear hoods and burn crosses. And so I wrote about my own tendency over the years to think of white as normative, and while not hating or any other way of living, thinking of it as different, as strange, as exotic, and sometimes as scary. And there's such arrogance in thinking of white as normative. And it's an ongoing journey for me to know how to play my instrument in a jazz ensemble that includes all of you. And the other thing I have to do to play in a jazz ensemble, besides knowing my instrument, is know how to listen very, very carefully. Because otherwise you come in with something discordant, or you fail to take that cell phone sound, which might have been discordant and weave it into the melody, right, into the tune. So that's how I'm sitting here right now, waiting and ready to listen to Valarie again, from which I learned so much. Thank you.
What happens in our monthly meetings is that I talk for a really, really long time, and Parker listens and then responds. And so we thought, well, I guess that's how we'll have to do it. So I'm going to be talking for a very long time. And then, so Parker, everybody, a few days ago, I was at the bedside of a woman who has been a mother to me for the last 10 years. Her name is Joyce. She was here last year. She sat right there, beaming, so proud. She was here even though she was fighting blood cancer. And about 10 days ago, we heard that her myeloma was no longer stable. So I rushed to her bedside and took her hand. Now, Joyce is white, raised in a Christian family, but she had come to see me as her daughter. And so she asked me to be there at the end. And when I arrived, I was lying on the bed next to her, holding her hand. And the nurse came in, and she was having a hard time breathing, so she was helping Joyce breathe. And then I took over, and I began to help Joyce breathe. And for 12 hours, we were breathing together, and we were pushing through the pain. And I left a little while, and I came back, and as soon as Joyce could hear that I was next to her again, she let go. And I cried out. But my mother, my own mother, was with me. And Joyce had asked us to do what we do in the Sikh faith, which is to be intimate with the body and to love the body and to thank the body. And so even though I was shaking, my mother began to show me how to do that. We took a bowl of water and we began to wash Joyce's body and thank every part of it for serving her and serving us. And I draped her in blue silks, and I adorned her with flowers, and she looked majestic, her body still warm. When we took her to the crematorium, I was the one, for the first time, I was the daughter figure who pushed her body into the furnace. I said my grandfather's prayer, "Tat divana lagi, the hot winds cannot touch you, you are shielded by love," right before I pressed the button to send her body up in flames. This happened just a few days ago. I am grieving, and I was trying to hide my grief. And when I saw you, it all came spilling out, and I realized that actually there's wisdom here. I did not realize how much the labor of dying mirrors the labor of birthing. That we have to breathe together and push together through all transitions. About a year ago, many of you heard me ask this question after the election. What if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb? What if this darkness is the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a country still waiting to be born? What if this is our great transition? I know so many of you this weekend have come up to me and told me, thank you. I see it as the womb, and I have to be honest with you that it was a question. And it's a question I'm asking every day because there have been days in this last year where I have felt ash in my mouth. The border walls and bans, the deportations and the detentions, the pipelines and the profiling, the hate crimes, to be a Sikh today, to be a brown woman with a little boy, called terrorist in the schoolyard is to be in a state of perpetual siege. It's to be alive in a time when hate crimes against people and my family are the highest they've been since 9/11. It's a time when I can't send my little boy to preschool in this country because I know the data on school bullying. I know that 7 out of 10 little Sikh boys who look like him are called Osama bin Laden, sent home crying, and that's just me. And when I think about all of the communities in harm's way right now, and all that we have lost, and people who we will not be able to redeem their pain, I taste ash in my mouth. And then there are days, like this morning, when I look out and I see what I have never seen before in my lifetime. I see us birthing new coalitions. I see women rising up in leadership. I see students marching in the street. I see solidarity between people who had never marched together before, from the undocumented to Black folks to indigenous folks to Sikhs and Muslims to this movement, I think because so many of us are in harm's way, is birthing a kind of revolutionary love that we have never paid attention to building before in the same way. And that inspires me. And so I ask myself, is this the labor of dying? Is this the labor of birthing? And I don't know, and maybe it is both. Maybe the myth of a white Christian America has to die for an America that has never yet to be born. All I know is that my mother taught me how to labor in love, through love, with love, because we may be laboring for our whole lives. We may not know the answer. Hope as a concept and a future outcome is not what is animating me anymore. Love is. Because inside of love, inside of breathing and pushing together, there is a possibility for joy. Joyce, while she was dying and while we were breathing together, could look at me, her eyes wide, her smile. Her last words to me were, "How beautiful are you?" In dying, she could see that beauty and wonder around her, even in me. So it's the labor that I'm interested in. It's how we labor that matters. And I believe that our task is to take up the ethic of love that has grounded nonviolent social movements in the past, but interpret it for a new time. And drawing upon the experiences of women and women of color, we are defining love as sweet labor. It is something that we practice and that we need to be practicing together. And I believe that if we pour this labor of love into others who do not look like us, into our opponents who disagree with us, and into ourselves, then love becomes revolutionary. And that's why I believe revolutionary love is the call of our times. And so, Parker, you've been hearing me trying to figure out how to equip people to practice this. How do we practice the labor of love? What are the tools that we need? And my team and I and all the amazing thought partners we've been in conversation with have come up with 3 core practices. This is a work in progress, so we can keep evolving it together. But I want to share those practices with you now, and then Parker will respond. So the first, how to love others. I'm calling that practice see no stranger. On the lips of spiritual geniuses, social reformers, the call to love others, to love people beyond our own family and our own tribe has come down to us through the centuries. It is grounded in this fundamental belief in our interconnectedness, that you are a part of me that I do not yet know. Yet we forget this truth. We forget it because our minds are wired to see in terms of us and them. The latest neuroimaging studies have shown us that when most of us are shown a picture of a person of another race, the amygdala, the region of the brain that is most responsible for fear and aggression, activates within a millisecond before conscious thought. This is what we're coming to understand as implicit bias. And so if you imagine if the only images that you have of others are black as criminal, Latino as illegal, trans and queer as immoral, Muslim and Sikh as terrorists, women as property, indigenous as savage, how do we change how we see one another? Those same studies have shown us that if you keep up the image of the other raced face long enough for conscious thought, then we see activity in the prefrontal cortex. And then two things can happen. If the person thinks, don't be racist, don't be racist, don't be racist, it doesn't work. Tolerance does not work. But if the person is primed to look at that face as belonging to a person, if they are primed to wonder, I wonder what that person is going to eat for dinner, or I wonder what breaks their heart, I wonder what their story is, then that single thought dampens the amygdala response. You see, it's not the first moment that we are responsible for, it is the second moment. It is an act of choice, it is an act of will to see no stranger. And so the practice that we are identifying, if you just say sister, brother, sibling, aunt, uncle, to the faces you see on the street, on the screen, on the subway, and you make that an active practice that you repeat, it is an orientation to the world toward wonder. Wondering about one another is the primary act in the labor of love. Empathy will follow, compassion will follow, but there will be times when you will have empathy fatigue. How many of us have empathy fatigue? It is hard to draw close to another person's pain, to let their grief become your own. It's not empathy that we have to maintain at that same constant rate. It is the practice of wonder, because wonder will return us to the labor of love. And so at this moment, when so many of our brothers and sisters or siblings are in harm's way, it is not enough to say, I will show up for you, and so you will show up for me. Love is not an exchange economy. This is about wondering about one another to the extent that we can listen deeply, that we can grieve with one another, and then let our feet move us when the other person is in harm's way. Solidarity requires depth. And what I realized, Parker, is that we are embodying that. White Quaker man, sick brown woman, the solidarity that we are demonstrating is so deep because we have spent time wondering and listening and being and fighting for one another. Mm-hmm. And so that's the first lesson. Who have you not yet come to know? Who have you not let yourself wonder about? It is not enough to do this. This is a tool. But we have to be with each other, to hear the voice, to feel the texture, in order to know how to love one another. That's love for others, see no stranger. All right, some of you may be thinking, but how in the world could I call the one in office brother? The white supremacist, my sister? How dare you even ask me to do such a thing? What I have come to understand is that when we practice this, even for people who hurt us or for people who disagree with us, when we practice love for our opponents, just by wondering about them, we begin to see the wound in them. They no longer become one-dimensional monsters who have power over us. They become human beings as frail as we are. And we start to see, we start to tend to the wound in them. We start to see that they hurt us out of their own sense of threat, out of their own sense of insecurity, because they are scared. They hurt us because they don't know what else to do with their pain. And so the person casting the vote against our existence, the one casting the policies against us, even the person pulling the trigger, we come to see that their participation in oppression comes at a cost. It cuts them off from their own capacity to love. We are not equally harmed, but we are all harmed by white supremacy. And so our job is to liberate all. Now, this is hard labor. And what I want to tell you is that this is not just a moral call. It is strategic. Because as a lawyer, as an activist, every time I have worked on campaigns that were going after a few bad guys, we got people arrested. We put police officers in prison for their abuse of their authority and excessive use of force, and that was important. But it never really changed very much. When we pointed our swords at institutions, that's when we saw change. I have worked on campaigns that have released hundreds of people from solitary confinement, that have won net neutrality, that have changed federal hate crimes policy, and have reformed a corrupt police department. And every single time, it was when we went after the political institutions and cultural norms that we began to see shift, that we began to even liberate the ones who were conditioned to see us as strangers. And when we did this, I discovered that forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is freedom from hate. Being free from hate means that we refuse to be like the ones who hurt us. And it opens up the unimaginable possibility of reconciliation. My uncle, a man who I called uncle, Balbir Singh Sodhi, was the first person killed in a hate crime after 9/11. I could never imagine talking to his killer. But we were able to forgive him. I could never imagine talking to the man who sexually assaulted me when I was young. 20 years later, we held our own Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I was able to forgive him. I know it's possible. I know it's possible, even when it's impossible to imagine. Gandhi, King, Mandela, they taught us a lot about how to love others and how to love our opponents. They named this possibility in our movement building. But remember, it took me 15 years to forgive my uncle's killer. It took me 20 years to forgive the man who assaulted me. These social justice leaders of the past, they didn't talk very much about how to love ourselves. This is a feminist intervention. This is, yes. This is Bell Hooks. This is Audre Lorde, who says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, but a form of political warfare. You see, for too long have women and women of color been told to suppress their rage, to suppress their grief in the name of love and forgiveness. But no longer should our suffering be mistaken for service. No more should we be ashamed of our anger, ashamed of our pain. And so the practice in how to love ourselves, we are calling breathe and push. That we need to breathe through the fire of our emotions. That Victor has taught me that rage by itself will burn us, but rage as part of a labor of love will birth us. And when we take each other's hand and breathe through those emotions, through that fire, then it does its work on us. It releases us enough to begin to wonder again. It returns us to the labor of love. I believe that we need all three directions in order for love to be revolutionary, others, opponents, and ourselves. Because loving just ourselves, it feels good, but is narcissism. And I like the yoga and lattes, I really do. But by itself, the self-help industry is making people feel like just taking care of themselves is engaging in transformation, and it is not when it is divorced from the other. So we can't just love ourselves. Loving just our opponents, that is self-loathing. And that is what communities of color and communities who are in harm's way should not be asked to do right now. Loving just others, but not our opponents and not ourselves, that is ineffective. This is where most of our movement is right now. Especially as we head into the midterms, we are going to be tempted to mirror the fear, the vitriol, the hate that we are resisting. And we're going to burn out if we're not loving ourselves. And so our vision, our job is to create the tools to ask people to think about what direction of love do you need to cultivate? And how do you do that? How do we do that together? And because we are part of a movement, if you are in harm's way right now, you let other folks do the loving our opponents. Right? If you are loving others right now and you need to, then you may need to be receiving some love so you remember how to love yourself. It takes all three directions, and we need to do it together because no one labors alone. I lay all this at your feet, Parker, as I do every week.
Thank you. I forgot to take notes.
What I love, and I'll set you up a little bit. What I love about this is that you reflect to me what is ancient about what I'm saying. There's ancient stuff in here. And then you are reflecting to me what is new. Mm-hmm. And so I love to hear.
Well, that's only because I'm ancient that I'm able to do that. This is the experience I've had for the last year or two of getting to listen to Valarie and being so filled with wonder myself about how your mind, heart, and spirit work that I start to wonder about myself. Because I do think that an initial act of wondering, when we start wondering about someone else, is the most accessible question, for me at least, is why is this person evoking the reaction in me that he or she is evoking? What does that say about me? And if I can answer that question honestly, it takes me beyond narcissism. Incidentally, my favorite book title, I highly recommend it, is a collection of poetry by Tony Hoagland called What Narcissism Means to Me. Yeah. And Sister Simone encouraged us to have moments of joy, and so I don't know how to do this without a little humor. But I do believe that if I am fully myself and respond honestly to these questions of why am I responding the way I am, with fear or with anger or with hatred, that it will take me beyond narcissism if I'm honest with myself, and if I am fully myself, shadow and light, not only my gifts and strengths, but my 3 deep dives into depression, where for 6 months at a time, and I've written and talked about this a lot because I think what's moved me so at this conference is watching a whole series of people do open heart surgery on themselves in front of this audience. And for me, that's the only way to go. That's the only way I've ever found to reach people. So 3 deep dives into depression, when day after day I was wondering if this was the day to end it all because the struggle was just too intense. If I'm fully myself with all of that, it's impossible to be full of myself. And my conversation with a lot of people who have my skin and my status is about being full of yourself, so full of yourself that there's no interior space to receive another. There's no interior room to listen. So I love your question about wondering, but given who I am, step number 1 has to be, Parker, why are you responding in the way you're responding? Because if you can't answer that question, there's no way you can understand, you can receive a person in a genuinely wondering way whose life story is so different from yours. You know just by looking at them. And you know just by asking a couple of the questions that Sister Simone asked of the server at a restaurant, and so forth. So that's my first response. My other response to you at lunch the other day when you told me this book was going slower than you wished, having told me about Joyce,
Yes.
I said, so it's a book about birth and life and death, and it's going too slow? Really?
I think my book editor may be here.
What is your time schedule? What is your strategic plan? But I want to resume listening to whatever questions you may have.
In our conversations together, you started to call revolutionary love the new nonviolence. Could you say more about that?
That's what excites me about revolutionary love. So I did my PhD at Berkeley in the 60s. That's all I have to say to either help you understand me or in some places to get thrown out. And I thought I was going to become a professor, but by 1969, the cities were burning, my heroes had been assassinated. It seemed to me that my calling was not to use my sociology in the classroom, but to use it in the streets. So I went to Washington, D.C. and became a community organizer for the next 5 years, and learned a tremendous amount as a thin-skinned young white man who really didn't know what he was doing, and who, when asked, why are you throwing away what could be a great academic career, said, I have no idea, but all I know is I can't not do it. I can't not do it. And when younger people come to me saying they're struggling with questions of vocation, I ask, what is it that you can't not do? Because if you don't know that yet, you're not ready to make a big decision for the rest of your life. And it was in that cauldron of my own white thin-skinnedness and my own not knowing, well, it was partly there that I started to trust not knowing. I started to trust the process of unlearning academic sociology and learning my sociology on the streets, and started to trust that I always had to return to beginner's mind, which is a form of wondering, right? I think it is. The Buddhists taught me that. The Buddhists say, you know, everything changes. And I say, yeah, everything changes except you telling me that everything changes. So if you would stop doing that, then you'd be totally consistent. So when I heard Valarie talk about what I regard as the new construct of nonviolent social change, what attracted me as new and what attracted me as salvific, a word that I think also means wholeness, and wholeness never means perfection. It always means embracing your brokenness along with all the rest. That's wholeness. It was the self-care piece, the self-love piece that was so critical to me. Because for many years in my activist life, I was operating not out of self-love, but out of some kind of unconscious guilt. And that kept getting me into emotional corners that it was very hard to get out of. It helped lead me into depression. There is much to be learned from being there, and there's a way to become a wounded healer with that if you're willing to do open heart surgery on yourself. But it's not a place that I wish anybody to go, nor do I wish to go there again. I would like to continue at age 80, as I get nearer that date, with my activism, an activism rooted in care for self that will sustain me over the long haul. And I think there's still a long haul to go. So that's what thrilled me about your concept.
One of the things that you've taught me, I mean, we started talking after the election, and I had this like, I have failed. I think that, which itself was an act of ego, as if any one person is responsible for anything. But there's something about being mother to a little boy and wanting to make the world safer for him and not being effective. And I just thought I had failed. And you said something to me I have never forgotten. You said, I don't think effectiveness is the right measure. You said, I think faithfulness is the right measure. Are you being faithful to your values? And by that measure, you're doing well. And I realized at that point that I had to let go of the animating force getting me out of the bed each morning being hope in some future outcome, that I couldn't measure my life or my worthiness based on what I produced or what we even produced together, that in fact, the measure is, in my case, how faithful can I be to the labor of love?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How did you learn that?
Out of desperation.
Well, just like when I had me too.
Right. Yeah. So in that period of time when, you see, I too was oppressed by the Eurocentric white male view of knowledge that was being laid upon me at Berkeley. Even people like me can find themselves crushed by that because it wants to replace my little story with their big story. And I have always resisted that. I've always thought of good teaching as an intersection between anybody's little story and the big story of literature or history or whatever. Because it's the little story that warms up the big story and makes it fit for human habitation. And it's the big story that illumines the little story and says, your story is significant. And I mean a lot of different big stories from a lot of different traditions. So I was oppressed by that. I entered into this activist work, unprepared, too thin-skinned for it, not wanting to just develop a shell. And I realized that I was crucifying myself over what a lot of people in Berkeley did in the 60s, which is to imagine in a totally egotistical way that they would change the world by the end of the decade, right? And when they didn't, they just went to work on Wall Street. A lot of them did, not all of them. I didn't want to live that kind of life, but I realized that if I kept measuring myself with outcomes now, it's not that they're unimportant, you always strive for them, but I would die in despair if effectiveness were my only measure, because I asked myself about my heroes who had been assassinated, Dr. King, of course. Was he able to die saying, I'm sure glad I devoted my life to love, truth, and justice, because now everyone in the world can check it off their to-do list now and forever? Is that kind of effectiveness available if we want to, if we devote ourselves to values of that sort? The answer is clearly no. And what happens if effectiveness is the only norm we've got, and I'm not saying forget about it, I'm saying subsume it a little, but if it's the only norm we got, what happens is clear as the nose on your face. We keep taking on smaller and smaller tasks because they're the only ones with which we can be effective. We're no longer interested in this country in educating a child. We're just interested in getting kids to pass tests, because you can be effective with that even if you have to cheat to do it. And we're willing to cheat in order to look like we're effective. And it's going on all over the place. And it's shameful. And it's an absolute derogation of the educator's responsibility. So if I can be faithful, and I work with mostly secular audiences, so I say it this way, if I can be faithful to my own gifts, what I possess, what's within my reach as a human being, if I can be faithful to the needs around me by keeping my eyes and ears open, listening and looking with care, and if I can be faithful within my own human limitations, that's self-love. If I can cut myself some slack for the places where I miss this, if I can be faithful to where my gifts intersect the needs of the world, then I think I can check out at the end of the road with some sense of satisfaction that I showed up in my own life as fully as I knew how and gave what I had to give, as my friend Greg Ellison says, to at least what's within 3 feet of me. Right? Greg talks about his, I hope you know Greg Ellison, this amazing professor at Candler, who's written Cut Dead But Still Alive and Fearless Dialogues. He's a friend and work partner of mine. He tells of his grandmother's teaching Greg. She said, you can't change the world, but you can always change what's going on within 3 feet of where you stand. And if I can be faithful to that, I'm not going to be asking questions about effectiveness. How many books did I sell? Did I get good enough reviews? All of that nonsense. I'm going to be feeling some sense of satisfaction that I showed up as best I knew how in my world with who I really was, warts and all.
Do you see how our conversations are endless? I want to thank you so much. I think we're wrapping. Is there any final word you want to give them or me? Which won't be final.
Blessings on everyone and the important work you're doing, and thank you for letting me be a part of it.